They called her a witch and sentenced her to the fire for being barren, but a poor farmer shocked everyone. This story, though it sounds like folklore, is etched into the history of a small American town, and I'm going to tell it to you now. What no one expected was the twist that would change the fate of an entire community. In the early 1920s, in the quiet valley of Cedar Creek, Virginia, a crowd gathered in the main square. The sun had barely risen, but desperate shouts already cut through the morning mist. "Witch! Burn the witch!" And there she was, a young woman of just 20, tied to a wooden stake, her eyes glistening, but her head held high. The town believed she was cursed for not being able to bear children. That was the cruel reason they condemned her to death. But was that the whole truth? What this town hid would have shocked you to your core. To understand how the entire town came to point a finger at her, you have to know how Eleanor's sorrow began. Eleanor was beautiful. She had fair skin, eyes like a clear spring, and long hair she kept braided for work. She married young, still a girl really, to a much older man named Silas, who owned the general store. At first, people would say, "What a handsome couple." But as the years passed, no children came. And in those days, my friends, an empty cradle was a scarlet letter. The neighbor women whispered by the old well, as if the water itself could carry secrets. "Did you see? No baby on the way. They say she's cursed, poor Silas." Eleanor pretended not to hear, but each word tightened a knot in her heart. One chilly afternoon, I remember it like I was there. A cold wind whipped through Main Street, and Eleanor went to buy salt at the store. Silas, her husband, wouldn't look her in the eye. He just shoved the dry sack of salt across the counter. She tried to break the ice. "Silas, maybe we could go see Granny Hattie, the midwife. Talk to her?" He slammed his hand on the counter. "I'm tired of wasting money on prayers and teas. Folks are already talking. Don't you make me a laughingstock." The word laughingstock was the first heavy stone thrown at her back. After that, doors would close slowly when she walked by, as if people feared divine punishment. At the market, the best tomatoes were always promised to someone else. At church, there was always an empty space on the pew around Eleanor, even when the rest of the church was full. Her clothes were simple and clean, but in the cruel eyes of the town, every fold became a flaw. "Look at how she ties her scarf. Looks like a root worker." When their marriage finally broke for good, Silas didn't whisper. He screamed, dragging her bag onto the porch and throwing it on the ground for everyone to see. "Get out, Eleanor. I'm not supporting a cursed woman." Trembling, she grabbed the handle of her bag. "I'm not cursed. I'm just—" Her voice failed her. "Just a woman." He spat on the ground and went inside, slamming the door. And with that slammed door, the heart of the town closed to her, too. Eleanor moved to a small, borrowed cabin at the edge of the woods. It was a simple shack with no luxuries. Just a plank bed, a wood stove, a picture of her dead mother, and a kettle she insisted on keeping polished. She sewed clothes for others, washed laundry in the creek, and baked bread to sell at dawn, returning with the coins bundled in a handkerchief. A few kind souls, like Granny Hattie, would sometimes buy an extra loaf just to help, but the rest of the town never forgave her empty womb. I remember one day Eleanor knelt in the town square to tie her shoe. Two women hurried past, and one of them whispered loudly enough to wound, "They say she looks at other women's bellies and makes them shrivel." Eleanor stood up slowly, looked at the sky, and took a deep breath, as if asking her own pain for permission to keep going. But not everything was a stone. In those days, there were still some who would lend a hand. Granny Hattie, the midwife, was one of them, a woman with a firm hand and a soft heart. Eleanor went to her one drizzly afternoon. "Granny, tell me what's wrong with me. Why do they talk like this?" The midwife examined her carefully, looked her in the eye, and said in a whisper that sounded like a prayer, "My child, a woman's body is a greater mystery than people are willing to accept. It's not a sin to not bear a child. Sin is pointing a finger." Eleanor offered a small smile, but it trembled. "I just want some peace." "Peace is something you plant, Eleanor, and you plant it with persistence." And she planted it, planting silence, planting self-respect, planting courage. But just as the seed of courage began to sprout, the town would come and stomp on it. At the St. Michael's procession, the statue passed by, and some women made the sign of the cross when Eleanor drew near, as if they needed to protect themselves from her presence. The preacher, Father Michael, didn't cast her out, but he didn't defend her either. He preached a tepid sermon that neither warmed nor consoled. And in our people, lukewarmness sometimes cuts deeper than a scream. It was on this winding road, and remember this image well, that his story met hers. Jedediah, a farmer of 30 years, strong and muscular, a man with calloused hands and eyes that stared out at the horizon, began to notice Eleanor's figure at the same time every morning, crossing the road with her basket of loaves. He watched her from a distance, respectfully, as one who recognizes their own loneliness in another. But that is a story for the next chapter, because before life could bring them together, the town's tongue still had to be sharpened. The next week, a calf on a merchant's farm fell ill. It was enough for someone to say, "Eleanor passed by here yesterday." Coincidence? Tongues become knives, you see, and you can't argue with a blade. It either cuts or it bleeds. Eleanor bled in silence. She'd go home, wash her face, light the stove, and before the small flame, she would repeat, "I'm not what they say I am." What no one knew, and what I promised to show you at the right time, was that the truth lived on the other side of a closed door, hidden by another person's shame. A truth that, when it came to light, would turn this town upside down. But for now, hold my hand and walk with me, step by step, because Eleanor's pain was about to meet a man's pain. And when two sorrows recognize each other, a love is born that can challenge even a crowded town square. It was the 1920s, folks. America was still learning to walk between tradition and progress, and the countryside was a picture frozen in time. Cedar Creek, Virginia, was surrounded by dense forests, hills covered in pine and oak, and dirt roads that kicked up dust in the summer and became mud in the winter. Anyone passing through could smell the fresh coffee, the burning wood in the stoves, the corn drying in the yards. But along with that smell of simplicity, there was also a heavy air, the air of judgment. The small towns were governed by three pillars: the church, the market, and the people's gossip. The priest's voice was one of authority, and the church bell dictated the routine. It rang at 6 in the morning, time to get up; noon, time for lunch; 6 in the evening, the Angelus prayer. You didn't argue, you obeyed. The market, in turn, was a place of power. The owners of general stores, of small farms, were respected like local lords. And the people had a gift for creating truths out of rumors. If three mouths told the same lie, the next day it became a law written on the town's heart. It was a setting for religious festivals lit by lanterns, with processions that cut through the cobblestone streets, and the twang of mandolins and guitars echoing at barn dances, with girls in flowing dresses and men in straw hats. But it was also a time of swift and merciless punishment. Anyone who didn't follow the pattern became a target. Young widows were looked at with suspicion. Single men were accused of being vagrants, and women without children were branded as cursed. Eleanor carried that weight like a shadow. In those days, fertility was considered wealth. Every child born was another pair of hands for the farm, another hope for the family bloodline. And when a woman couldn't produce an heir, she wasn't just seen as useless. She was considered dangerous, as if she carried a hidden power capable of withering crops, making children sick, and ruining harvests. On a Sunday morning, the town scene was always the same: the 10 o'clock service. Families entered in a line, men in their best suits, women with veils over their heads, children holding hands. Eleanor, however, walked alone to the last pew, always leaving space so no one had to sit beside her. The priest would greet her from a distance, but never spoke her name in public. It was as if her presence was tolerated, but not accepted. Life on the farm also had its hard side. The hoe, the scythe, the scorching sun, the biting cold of the mountains. Jedediah, the farmer we're getting to know, went through this every day. He worked from sunup to sundown to wrest from the earth what he could to feed his skinny cattle and his own dignity. The scene was one of sweat, sacrifice, and solitude. The houses were made of wood, built with their own hands, with no luxuries at all. Packed dirt floors, a lean-to roof, and a single lantern trembling in the corner when night fell. There was no electricity, no wide roads. There was no doctor on call. When someone fell ill, it was a matter of herbal tea, prayer, a healer's blessing, and often death came early. It was in this environment that stories of pain, faith, and prejudice became intertwined. Eleanor lived branded as cursed. Jedediah, although admired for his strength, carried on his shoulders the loneliness of a man who had never had a family. He was also watched from afar. How could a man with so much health and vigor not have found a wife? The town invented explanations because silence didn't fit in their mouths. And so the atmosphere that would bring these two destinies together was formed. A small town shaped by faith and distrust, where every look weighed more than a written sentence, and where, in the midst of processions, harvests, and conversations at the general store, two hearts would grow close, not by chance, but by the pain that surrounded them. Jedediah always woke before the bell rang, while the sky was still a bruised purple and the low mist covered the pastures. He was already in his boots, shirt open at the chest, breathing in the cold that burned his nostrils. He was a man of 30, strong and muscular, with arms scarred by years of swinging a hoe and broad shoulders from carrying sacks of corn and bundles of firewood. The farm he inherited from his father, old man Jedediah Sr., had no luxuries: weak soil, a crooked barn, half a dozen skinny cows, and a wooden house that groaned in the wind. But there was honor there. His father died early, and Jedediah learned two things: that the earth has no mercy on anyone, and that loneliness, if you treat it right, becomes a good friend. That's why, while many men in the region spent their mornings leaning on the counter at the general store, he spent his in the corral, checking the salt, cleaning the troughs, and saving what he could of the herd. Life was a stretched thread, and he walked it with steady feet. One day his friend Bart leaned on the fence with his hat in his hands. "Jed, man, you can't go on being alone. Get married, find a girl, have an heir." Jedediah scratched his chin. "I'll have an heir, friend. I just need life to slow down a little so I can dream." "Dreams come when you call them, Jed," Bart said. He smiled faintly, half disbelieving, and went back to work. The truth was, Jedediah wasn't a man of many words. It wasn't from arrogance, it was from a place of care. Words to him were like seeds. They were only worth it if they sprouted, and almost no one around there gave a word the water it needed to sprout. They preferred the chatter, the judgment. He knew every story the town invented, including the most recent one about the childless woman they called a witch. Every now and then he'd hear her name whispered, Eleanor. And even though he'd never met her, his heart would ache as if he already knew her pain. With every swing of the hoe, he'd remember his father. A man's worth ain't measured by how much land he's got, but by how he tends to it. Jedediah tended. He mended fences, pruned branches, and propped up fallen trees. In the late afternoon, sweat shone on his open chest and his belly ached with hunger. But it was a clean pain from a man who had done what needed to be done. At night, he'd eat a plate of beans, cornbread, and a hunk of cured meat, and he'd sit on the porch to listen to the crickets. The lantern would tremble, and the wind would carry the smell of firewood from the neighboring houses. Sometimes a bad thought would circle. What if all of this was never enough? He'd chase the thought away with a gulp of coffee. It was on one of those late afternoons that destiny turned a corner. Jedediah heard that Granny Grace's newborn calf was sick. He grabbed his cloth bag with animal remedies and went to her farm. On the way, he passed two women who were whispering, and when he got close, they fell silent. After he passed, they went back to their muttering. "They say Eleanor went by there before the calf got sick. I heard she can even dry up a cow's milk." Jedediah quickened his pace, his jaw tight. He didn't like gossip, especially the kind that hurts the weak. At the farm, he did what he had to do. As he was leaving, he paused at the gate and saw a thin figure on the other side of the road with a basket on her arm. He recognized the braid, the quiet way she walked, as if she wanted to go unnoticed. It was Eleanor. He didn't have the right to speak to her, he thought, not out of fear, but out of respect for another's solitude. Still, the courage he used to face a storm stirred in his chest. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Eleanor turned slowly, like one who fears the next dart. "Good afternoon. You pass by here every day. The road is bad on this curve. If you like, you can cut through my pasture. It's a firmer path." She hesitated. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of history. Finally, in a small voice, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Jedediah. I don't want to be a bother." "Bothers are born of malice, not people," he replied, measuring his own words. "Hardworking people are never a bother." The next day, the same scene, and the next and the next. Little by little, those words found water. Eleanor, always so proper, would stop at the gate and ask if she could cross. Jedediah would open it, lean on it, and the two would walk a few paces side by side, without hurry, like those who learn trust at the pace of their own heartbeats. "You take good care of your land," she said one afternoon. "The land takes care of you when you take care of it first," he replied, looking at the hills. "And of people, too." She held her basket tighter. "The town doesn't always take good care of people. Towns are like beasts that obey whoever screams loudest," Jedediah said with a touch of sadness. "But the land, it still listens to a whisper." The friendship was born there, regretting that it had come so late. Eleanor began to bring him fresh bread when she left in the pre-dawn darkness. Jedediah, in return, would always leave her a dozen eggs, a handful of potatoes, a bunch of fresh greens. Nothing planned, all understood. Sometimes she would sit for a while on the porch and he would mend harnesses, pretending his heart wasn't stumbling in her presence. "They'll talk about us," Eleanor said one day, her clear eyes on the ground. "They already do," he replied bluntly. "I can face whatever words they throw at me." "And what if the words turn to stones?" Jedediah raised his head. "Stones you can betch or break." He was not a man of bravado, but of silent promises. And the promise he began to make, without even realizing it, was to stay. To stay when no one else would. To stay when the world turned its back. Because he knew that the loneliness of two people could stitch together a shelter, but the shadows were advancing faster than the sunset. The first thunder came in the form of a bitter rumor. A young child, sick with a fever, got worse overnight. Someone swore they had seen Eleanor crossing the street the day before. That was enough. The sharp tongues came out of the windows like knives. What was a whisper became an accusation. What was pain became a spectacle. That night, Jedediah sat on his porch longer than usual. The lantern danced, and he held the arm of the chair tightly to keep his anger from doing something foolish. He remembered his father. "When the storm wants to take you, plant your feet firmly on the ground." He planted them and made a decision. Whatever came, Eleanor would not be alone. The next morning, she appeared at his gate, bathed, her eyes washed clean. Jedediah unlatched the gate calmly, like one who is opening a home to family. "Come on in. No one will touch you here." Eleanor took a deep breath, like someone finding air after a long time. "Thank you." "As long as I have two arms, you'll have a shelter," he said firmly. And that's how the man the town forgot and the woman it only remembered for its malice began to recognize each other not as each other's salvation, but as true companions in the middle of a narrow world. Outside, the wind was already changing its smell. Rain was coming, screaming was coming, judgment was coming. Inside, a good silence was growing, of respect and care, which would soon have to become courage. If this chapter has you hooked, please consider subscribing to Windswept Tales so we can keep telling stories of our past with even more passion. Destiny sometimes likes to stitch encounters with a thin, almost invisible thread. That's how Eleanor and Jedediah first drew close in a way no one in town expected. It was market morning, the sun was already beating down on the square, and the noise of wagons, chickens, and people bargaining mixed together like a disorganized song. Eleanor was walking with her basket of bread, her head down, trying to go unnoticed, but the sharp tongues didn't rest. Two women followed her with their eyes, whispering loudly, "Look at the witch, poor man who gets close to her." Suddenly, one of them approached and without shame shoved Eleanor's shoulder, making her basket fall to the ground. The loaves scattered in the dust of the square. The young woman, embarrassed, knelt quickly to gather them, but heard laughter behind her. Tears were already welling in her eyes, not just from the humiliation, but from the certainty that no one would defend her. It was in that instant that a strong shadow fell over her. It was Jedediah. He was coming from the store, carrying a sack of corn on his back, sweat glistening on his open chest. He dropped the sack on the ground and with long strides approached. His voice was low but firm. "Enough. The women recoiled in surprise. Jedediah knelt and helped Eleanor gather the loaves. He handed them back to her, one by one, wiping the dust off with his own calloused hands. Eleanor, her breath trembling, tried to thank him. "You didn't have to, sir." He looked her in the eyes, unafraid of who was listening. "Yes, I did. No one here has the right to treat you like that." Silence fell over the square for a few seconds. People stopped to watch a man defending Eleanor. That was too much audacity for a town held captive by its superstitions. A voice rose from the middle of the crowd. "Careful, Jed. That woman will bring you bad luck." He turned his head slowly, and his steady gaze made the man lower his eyes. "Bad luck is the cowardice of attacking someone who's already suffering," he replied curtly. Eleanor, still stunned, held the loaves against her chest, as if they were a shield. Jedediah picked his sack of corn back up, heaved it over his shoulders, and walked away. But before he left, he looked at her and said softly, "Don't listen to them. They talk because they don't know what loneliness is." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The gesture of that man echoed in her memory. No one had ever stood between her and the town's hatred. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was not completely alone. On the other side of town, Jedediah wasn't sleeping either. Sitting on his porch, watching the darkness swallow the pines, he remembered Eleanor's face, marked by suffering but with a dignity that couldn't be extinguished. He murmured to himself, "She carries the weight of the world and still finds the strength to keep going." That encounter, so simple in the eyes of those who passed through the square, was like a knot tied in the thread of fate. From that moment on, the lives of Jedediah and Eleanor could no longer walk separately. And even if the world outside was ready to condemn them, a feeling was born inside them that no one could stop. The next step in this story is when that timid friendship turns into complicity, and little by little, the heart of each finds a place to rest in the other. I remember it as if I were walking behind them, hearing the creak of the gate and the soft sound of their steps on the gravel. After that day at the market, Eleanor began cutting through Jedediah's pasture every morning with her basket of still warm bread. It wasn't planned, it was a silent agreement, one of those that are born when two solitudes touch. "Excuse me," she would say, stopping at the gate. "The house is yours," Jedediah would reply, unlatching the gate calmly. The routine settled in like a well-folded quilt. He would leave a stool on the porch for Eleanor to rest her legs. She, in turn, would always set aside 2 bigger loaves of finer flour, as if disguising affection as kindness. And in those daily minutes, conversation would sprout in a low voice, without hurry, like coffee filtered through a clean cloth. "The wind blows different here," Eleanor commented once, watching the pines sway slowly. "A wind that passes from one hill to the next learns to have respect," Jedediah said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Here it doesn't knock things down, it just gives a warning." In the hours when the work was hard, Eleanor would offer to help. It wasn't much, but it was important. Picking corn, sorting beans, sweeping the yard, scrubbing a copper pot until it shone in the afternoon light. At first, Jedediah would refuse. "You already work too hard, ma'am." "It's one less gesture of humiliation remembered," she replied firmly, and he understood. One afternoon, the rain came suddenly. Thick drops drummed on the roof, and the smell of the earth rose like a prayer. Eleanor ran to the porch, laughing softly, her braid dripping. Jedediah came out with a burlap sack. "You'll get wet." "I can handle wet," she returned, taking the sack. "It's the street that scares me." He didn't ask what the street did because he already knew. Instead, he lit the wood stove and put the kettle on. The small sound of the water heating filled the kitchen, and that simple sound sealed the house from the outside, as if the world out there had no door. "Granny Hattie taught me a calming tea," Eleanor said, separating leaves of anise and lemon balm. "I've always been a coffee man," Jedediah smiled faintly. "But today, I'll try anything that brings you peace. Trust, when it's born, tests you." In the late afternoon, Eleanor arrived with a scraped face. On her way, a loose stone had made her fall on a small embankment. Jedediah ran, knelt at the edge of the yard, and his voice came out lower than usual. "Did you hurt yourself badly?" "It just stings." "Stinging is the body's way of saying, 'Take care of me,'" he replied, washing the scrape with warm water and a touch so gentle it was almost timid, as if he feared breaking her. It was the first time their hands had met by accident. Eleanor pulled back a fraction, not out of fear of him, but out of surprise at being treated with such tenderness. And Jedediah realized that for some wounds, the remedy is to be seen without being judged. The town, however, doesn't like it when another's silence becomes a shelter. The next morning, a piece of cloth with a crude drawing of a triangle and a flame appeared tied to the fence. Eleanor saw it first. "It's for me," she said almost in a whisper. "It's for us," Jedediah corrected, ripping the cloth down and throwing it into the fire. "As long as you pass through here, no one will touch you without touching me." They didn't plan courage, they practiced it. Eleanor continued to bring bread, and now also a handful of herbs, some smaller biscuits for when hunger hit him in the corral. Jedediah, in turn, began to leave a sack of corn at the door of Eleanor's cabin in the early morning without a note. She knew it was from him by the way it was tied, always the same, a double knot his father had taught him. These small secrets became a language. I am here without needing to say I am here. When the rain stopped, the cold days came. Jedediah took his father's woolen coat and put it over Eleanor's shoulders when she was shivering on the porch. "It's too big," she said, laughing awkwardly. "It's big enough to hold comfort and peace," he replied. "We almost don't have comfort. Peace is something we invent." On the farm, things also began to fall into place. With Eleanor's help, the hen house got a new fence, the vegetable garden held firm, and the corral, clean and dry, smelled of care. At night, they would share the comfortable silence of two presences that didn't demand anything from each other but sincerity. Sometimes, the fire in the stove would crackle, and Eleanor would tell a piece of her past without drama, like someone folding an old sheet. "When I was younger, my mother used to say that pain likes noise, but healing prefers silence." "Your mother knew things," Jedediah would murmur. "Here, we'll give healing a home." Step by step, respect took affection's hand. It wasn't the boisterous passion of a play. It was a feeling with deep roots, growing underground without showing off. The world outside, however, was paying attention. Eyes peered from the cracks, whispers gained volume. The town's gossip mongers began pointing to Jedediah's porch, as if sin lived there. And when the town's tongue learns the path to a house, sooner or later it will try to get in. But for now, you just need to know this. The complicity between them was built. In every cup of tea, in every loaf of bread shared, in every small gesture that said, "You are not a burden, you are someone." And that is exactly why the blow that would come from outside would hurt so much. Because now there was something to protect, and they would protect it. When two hearts begin to find shelter in each other, the small town notices. And in a place where everything is seen, where every whisper runs faster than a storm wind, no secret can last. That's how the people of Cedar Creek began to notice that Eleanor no longer walked alone every morning. Curious eyes saw her cross Jedediah's gate, saw her leave the farm with a lighter basket, or stay a few extra minutes on his porch in the late afternoon. At first, it was just sideways glances, but glances, when they come together, become a tongue, and the tongues here were sharp. "Did you see? Jedediah is bewitched now," whispered one laundress by the creek. "A strong man like that getting mixed up with that cursed woman," replied another, beating the clothes against the stone with more force. "They say she sucks the life out of men. That's probably why he never married." The buzz spread through the narrow streets. At the general store, customers commented in a low voice, but loud enough for Jedediah to hear. One man with a mocking laugh let out, "Careful, Jed. That witch is going to dry up your cows and your luck." Jedediah turned slowly, stared at the man with a steady gaze, and replied, "Luck is not being like you." Silence fell over the counter. But the silence of fear is not the same as the silence of respect. When Jedediah left, the conversation started again, more poisonous than before. Eleanor, in turn, felt the stares burn her back every time she walked down the street. Once, when she entered the church, she saw mothers pulling their children away from the pew where she sat. The priest, without the courage to defend her, remained cold in the pulpit, preaching generic sermons, as if her name was a sin even to be mentioned. On a Saturday afternoon, Eleanor was walking through the market when a group of boys followed her. One of them, more daring, threw a handful of dirt at her feet, and yelled, "Go plant your curses somewhere else, witch!" Eleanor stopped, clenched her fists, but did not respond. It was Jedediah who appeared from behind the group, tall, imposing, his face hard. He grabbed the boy's arm firmly. "Apologize." The boy's eyes widened. "I won't." Jedediah's voice was low, like thunder before the rain. "Apologize." "Sorry," he muttered awkwardly, letting his fist full of dirt fall. Eleanor lowered her eyes, but inside her heart pulsed with a mix of fear and gratitude. When they walked away, she said in a low voice, "You can't face everyone for me, Jedediah." "I can face the world if I have to," he replied firmly. "I won't let them make you bleed alone." But the malice of the people didn't stop. On the contrary, the more they saw Eleanor gain strength, the more they saw Jedediah beside her, the more their anger grew. To those people, their love was not love. It was a spell. And a spell in that time of blind beliefs had only one end: punishment. The bitterness took hold, and what was once a street corner whisper turned into accusation at church meetings. Community leaders said that Jedediah was lost and that Eleanor needed to be purified for the good of everyone. It was like a silent fire, spreading through the houses, through late-night conversations, through minds willing to blame someone for any misfortune. If a crop failed, it was Eleanor's fault. If a child fell ill, it was Eleanor's fault. Even the cold wind that blew from the mountains seemed to the people to be a sign of the curse she carried. And so, step by step, the town prepared not to judge, but to condemn. Eleanor and Jedediah, although together, barely knew that the shadows of the square were already stretching over them, ready one day to trap them in a cruel fate. Their love was a flame, but the people's hatred was the wind. And a flame, no matter how beautifully it shines, always risks being fanned until it burns more than it should. I can still smell the wood smoke of the night when courage decided to knock on their door. After weeks of careful steps and quiet conversations, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the cold from the pines, it was a warmth that came from within, like an ember hidden under ashes. Eleanor arrived later than usual, her shawl pulled tight over her shoulders. On Jedediah's porch, the lantern trembled as if it were afraid of the wind. He opened the gate, serious and attentive as always. "I thought you weren't coming today." "I almost didn't," she replied, looking at the road, "but courage needs practice." "Then practice here," he said, making room for her on the wooden bench. "Here, courage doesn't walk alone." They were quiet for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant crackle of a log in a stove. The silence between them was already familiar, but tonight it wasn't empty. It held promises. Eleanor put a folded cloth on her lap. "I made something for you, Jedediah." He unwrapped it slowly. It was a simple vest of thick wool, carefully sewn. "It's for the cold mornings," she said a little awkwardly. "It's not much." "It's shelter," he replied, running his hand over the weave. "And shelter is everything." Jedediah stood up and went into the house. When he returned, he was carrying a small old wooden box with a creaking lid. He opened it in front of her. Inside was a small medal of St. Michael, worn from so many fingers touching it. "It was my father's. I'm not giving it to you to tie you to a prayer. I'm giving it to you because when I can't find the words, he speaks for me." Eleanor took a deep breath, touching the medal as if touching a childhood memory. "They'll talk." "They already do," he repeated calmly. "But our word has to be worth more than theirs." A fine rain started to fall, chasing away the cold. Jedediah picked up his father's guitar and played 2 timid chords. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I didn't know you played." "I play when no one is watching." "Then today you'll play for me. I won't tell a soul." He risked a slow folk tune with long lyrics about people who gather pieces to build a home. Eleanor, her chin resting on her hands, seemed to be listening to her own life. At the last chord, her voice came out softly. "I feel seen." "I see you," Jedediah said, simply like one who says, "There's bread in the oven." Love didn't make a sound when it arrived. First, it was a gesture, him clearing branches from her path, her leaving him small biscuits for when hunger hit in the middle of the corral. Then it was a habit, the extra cup at the table, the stool at just the right angle so the lantern light didn't bother her eyes when they talked. And finally, it was a decision made without words, to walk side by side, even if the entire town turned its neck to watch. On a Sunday morning they decided, and I saw it as if I were holding my breath, to walk across the square together. Not holding hands, not yet, but without the cautious distance they used to keep. Eleanor carried a bag of cornmeal to sell. Jedediah had a sack of corn over his shoulder. They could have taken the back road, the emptier one, but they chose the main one. It was a gentle statement. We are here. The eyes came first, then the mouths. Bewitched. Poor soul. It's a sin, a challenge to God's will. Jedediah walked straight, like a man who has no time for a headwind. At Mr. Harrison's stall, he bought a piece of blue calico cloth, came back, and handed it to Eleanor to make a dress. Not because I want to hide you, but because I want to see you shine when the sun hits you. Eleanor swallowed hard. No one had given her a present since her mother had passed. I can't pay you back. You already did, he said, by staying. That same afternoon, as they walked back along the dirt road, fate demanded a test. 3 boys lined up in the path, nudged each other, and came forward with easy laughter. The first one, with a crooked cap, said loudly, Hey, Jedediah, this the kind of harvest you're after? Jedediah held the sack of corn with his left hand, and with his right, he grabbed the boy's advancing wrist. He didn't squeeze, he held firm. What I plant and what I harvest is my business. You go tend to your own patch. The other 2 boys backed away. The first one, red with shame, pulled his arm away and walked off cursing. Eleanor, pale, whispered, They're going to do something worse. Let them try, Jedediah said without bravado. I don't get out of the way of a stone meant for you. That night, their romance found a name. It was no longer a friendship that hid behind good manners. Inside the kitchen, with the fire low and the kettle sighing, Jedediah dried Eleanor's braid with a cloth. His large hands were careful not to hurt her. His steady eyes asked permission. I don't know how to say pretty things, he began, but ever since you came through that gate, this house has felt like a home. And ever since you opened that gate for me, the street has felt less like a street, she replied, her voice choked. I'll be here, he concluded. And I'll be here too, Eleanor said, like one making a vow. The first kiss came without warning, as short as possible, as if they both feared the town would hear. It was chaste but complete, and it left a good jolt in the air, the kind that makes the heart skip a beat and then beat more truly afterward. When they pulled away, Eleanor rested her forehead on his chest and listened to the rhythm. Your heart works just like mine, doing the same job, holding on. And they held on for a few days, enshrinning the sweet taste and the right weight of being together. But love in a land of loose tongues turns into a challenge. A malicious note appeared on the church door, a crude drawing of a woman in flames. At the market, salt was sold at double the price to Eleanor. At the general store, the flour Jedediah always bought ran out just before he arrived. Small things that, added together, wound deeply. Even so, they chose to affirm life. They went together to visit Granny Hattie, who received them with the eyes of one who already knew. The world doesn't change with a shout. It changes with endurance, the midwife said, placing 2 coffees on the table. If it's love, let it be formed by respect, care, and hard work. The rest is just envy dressed up as morality. Jedediah held Eleanor's hand under the table, a quick, almost secret touch, and he nodded. There was a plan there without a map. To keep going. And they did. Jedediah built a new fence along Eleanor's path, this time higher and with a firm latch. She painted his cabin window with paint made from earth and oil, a blue that seemed to hold the sky. On the first night of the full moon, he planted a jasmine bush by the porch. The scent clung to the sheet Eleanor hung next to it and never left. Forbidden romance. That's what the town named it. But for them, it was just the simple name of things. Bread divided, water shared, work done together, promises that didn't need to be sworn. All of this, however, also raised a target, and the target in that land demanded an arrow. The arrow would come too quickly. All it took was a child's fever, a bad harvest, an ox that fell in the mire, and the tired town wanted a culprit. The rest, you'll see. For now, hold on to this moment. 2 adults standing shoulder to shoulder, signing with their bodies the decision to remain together. The night fell on Cedar Creek with the weight of a wet blanket. The town hall, with its high windows and wood swollen by the drizzle, held a narrow room in the back that people called a jail, but that on that night was just a room of cruel waiting. Eleanor was there, sitting in a chair, her shawl on her shoulders, and the St. Michael medal clasped between her fingers. The lantern made shadows tremble on the damp wall, as if the wall itself were afraid. Outside, the town gathered, torches lit, whispers growing, boots scraping the cobblestones. The bell, from time to time, rang short and dry, a reminder that dawn was coming without mercy. Jedediah stood on the steps, his hands on his knees, like a man holding the earth to keep it from being washed away by a flood. Granny Hattie, steady beside him, adjusted the scarf on her head and said in a threat of a voice, "I'm going to try to get in. They respect me as a midwife. Maybe they'll let me see the girl." "She's not a girl," Jedediah retorted, tired and tender at the same time. "She's a woman, and she's mine." Sheriff Cooper came down with 2 deputies, that air of authority that confuses a uniform with justice. Jedediah stood up slowly, his shadow covering half the door. "I want to talk to Eleanor. 5 minutes." "5 minutes," Cooper said, checking a watch that made more noise than it did good. "And no fuss. The community wants peace." "Peace isn't born of injustice," Jedediah cut in, but he took a deep breath and entered. The room smelled of wet paper and iron. When Eleanor saw him, she gave a small smile, the exact size that pain allows. "You came. As long as I'm breathing, I'll come," he replied, taking off his father's woolen coat and putting it on her shoulders. "It's cold." "The cold is less cruel than the people," she said, holding the fabric with her hands, "but I can bear it." He knelt beside her so that his face was at her level. It wasn't the kneeling of a man begging, but the gesture of a man who chooses to stay. "I wish I could just take you out of here with my own hands. And I wish I could take you out of this suffering," she replied, lightly caressing his hair. "But we're not going to give them the show they want. I'm not going to abandon you." "I know, that's why I'm standing." Granny Hattie managed to get in right after, with the courage of one who has seen many people born and die. She closed the door and approached Eleanor, examining her pulse, as if caring for the body was also a way of straightening the spirit. "You holding firm?" "I am," Eleanor said. "My heart just stumbles sometimes." "A heart stumbles to remind you it still has a path," the midwife replied. "I brought you water, and I brought you words. The truth doesn't die in the dead of night." Jedediah looked at the medal in Eleanor's hand. "I gave it to you to say what I couldn't." "Then listen to what I can say," she said, her clear eyes unblinking. "If morning comes and it's heavy, don't let it destroy you. You plant. Remember the jasmine on the porch? You tend to things, you make life obey you." "Life has obeyed me since the day you walked through my gate," he replied, his voice choked. "If I can't protect you, my arms have no meaning." Outside, Silas was circling like a dog barking behind a fence. Of course, there were people who listened to him. Anyone who likes to throw a stone always finds a wall. He pointed to the square, instructed men to pile up wood, and talked about purification. Father Michael, pale, watched from a distance, swallowing his own cowardice with the same hand that blessed processions. When the priest walked by the steps, Jedediah stopped him. "Father, I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm asking for a word, just one." The priest looked away. "My son, the community." "The community is me too," Jedediah cut in curtly, "and I say no." Inside the room, Granny Hattie took a folded cloth from her pocket. Inside were 3 sprigs of herbs, rosemary, sage, and mint. "It's not a spell," she said, looking at Eleanor with affection and defiance. "It's a reminder of what heals. Smell it. Remember your mother." Eleanor breathed in the green scent that rose from the cloth. For a moment, the room stopped being a prison and became an old backyard. An afternoon of sunshine, water splashing on her knees, the laughter of living people. A gleam of peace settled in her eyes. "Thank you." The 5 minutes turned into 15. Cooper came and knocked on the door with the butt of his pistol. "Time's up." Jedediah stood up slowly, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. He held Eleanor's hands between his, large and calloused, and spoke softly so only she could hear. "When the sun rises, look at me. I'll be there. If I see you falter, I'll tear this world down." Eleanor smiled, the rare smile of women who learn to be strong out of necessity, not by choice. "I'll look, and I'll stay." He left, his chest heavy but his steps firm. On the steps, the crowd parted without wanting to, pushed aside by the sheer force of his resolve. The night stretched out like a barbed wire. Every minute cut. The sound of the wood being piled up tore through the air. Someone brought a barrel of kerosene, another tested a match, blew on it, and laughed. The laughter of people who don't know what their own hands are signing. Granny Hattie planted herself at the edge of the square, her arms crossed, and warned, "As long as I'm standing here, anyone who touches Eleanor will have to go through me too." "You're a woman, Hattie," Cooper scoffed. "And that's how we know how to give birth to courage," she replied without lowering her eyes. The sky lightened with the first gray streak. Roosters crowed out of sync, as if the dawn were coming in crooked. Jedediah took a deep breath, firmed the knot in the rope that tied his own soul, and remembered his father. "When the storm wants to take you, plant your feet." He planted them. Inside, Eleanor stood up, felt the wood of the window, the cold coming in through the cracks, passed her hand over the metal, and spoke softly for the silence to hear. "I am not what they say, I am what I do." And I loved. The night of a sentence has no fireworks, only waiting. It has a promise, it has a man on the outside who became a wall, and a woman on the inside who became a lighthouse. When the light finally touched the roofline, the town was already waiting, not to judge, but to watch. The rest, what they would do with what they called justice, would be announced in the next moment. For now, hold on to this image. Eleanor standing, her hands firm, Jedediah beside her, whole in a small town, drunk on fear, about to turn a rumor into a verdict. Because that's how tragedies begin, not with screams, but with small steps that no one bothered to stop. The dawn came hard, without color. I saw the mist descend from the hills like a sad bride's veil, and the square in Cedar Creek, which on a festival day hosted guitars and laughter, awoke surrounded by a pile of wood, stretched ropes, and a circle of people who spoke in whispers, as if afraid of their own consciences. The bell rang 3 times, short and dry. It was the call. They brought Eleanor down Main Street. She came on foot, her head high, her shawl pulled tight over her shoulders, the metal hidden in the palm of her hand. It wasn't stubbornness, it was dignity. She didn't scream or cry. She just walked like one who knows the truth doesn't need permission to exist. Jedediah appeared right behind her, his shirt open at the chest, his face marked by the all-night vigil. He tried to approach, but 2 deputies crossed their rifles. "Stay back," Sheriff Cooper ordered, polished like a freshly sharpened knife. "The community has decided." "A community that decides with fear always decides wrong," Jedediah replied, his voice grave and clear. "I'll give you my land, my cattle, everything I have, but don't you touch her." Silas, her ex-husband, stepped forward with a thin smile. "See that, Cooper? The spell is working. He's giving everything for the witch." Jedediah turned his face slowly, his eyes going from Silas to the crowd. "I give because it's right. And you, what have you given besides cowardice?" Granny Hattie broke through the crowd, small and firm, her scarf tied tight, with the look of one who has birthed courage into the world. "I want to speak," she said. "The fever comes from the shallow well. I said so months ago. The water is sick, not the girl." "You have no proof, ma'am," the sheriff retorted. "I have experience," she replied. "An experience in a place with no doctor is the same as a law." Father Michael approached, his face pale, his eyes shifty. Jedediah held the priest's arm with respect, but no gentleness. "Just one word, Father. Say no." The priest took a deep breath, opened his mouth, and fear closed it for him. "My children, the peace of the town, the divine will." "God doesn't need your silence," Granny Hattie cut in, unblinking. "A peace that burns people is a lie." Eleanor, until then silent, took a step forward. "Let them." Her voice was not loud, but it crossed the entire square. "I'm not a witch. I don't bring bad luck. I sow, I wish, I plant, I pray. If you want a name to blame, Look in the mirror. A murmur ran like a bad wind. The sheriff made a gesture and two men led Eleanor to the stake. They tied her wrists with the practical knots of men who had learned to tie up a bull and thought they could tie up a human life. Jedediah advanced 3 steps. Two men held him by the shoulders. He didn't fight back with a punch. He fought back with a word. If you light that fire, you'll be burning with it the shame you should have for being grown men who follow a rumor. Enough! Cooper slammed his stick on the ground. To prevent a riot, tie the man up too. You try, Jedediah replied fearless, and the town will see who is truly fierce. Time stretched like wire. I saw Eleanor search for Jedediah's face in the crowd. She found it, and in that thread of a glance, they said everything they needed to. I am here, and I'm staying. One of the deputies brought the torch closer to test the kerosene on the wood. The snap of the flame seemed to bite the silence. Silas, puffed up with borrowed importance, wanted to speak again. See? Even the fire recognizes the truth. Eleanor turned her face to him, calmly like one who has already gone through many long nights. You called me cursed to hide your own shame. May God forgive you, I already have. Silas took a half step back as if he'd been slapped with a glove. Granny Hattie ran to the foot of the makeshift gallows, held her herbs high. I'm not leaving here, she said to the deputies. If you light that fire, I'll stand in front of it. You'll be arrested, Hattie, Cooper yelled. I've been a prisoner enough times in this life, she replied without lowering her eyes. Today, I'm standing. Jedediah then did what none of them expected. He opened his hands as if releasing the world and spoke to the entire town. Listen closely. I, Jedediah Williams, will take any blame you want to invent. If you need a body to quiet your fears, take mine. But not her. The circle hesitated because courage, when it appears, exposes the cowardice of everyone. An old man at the edge of the square took off his hat. A girl hugged her own shawl. The priest took a step forward and stopped. Cooper, his authority wounded, gestured for them to hurry. Two men pulled the rope on the stake. The wood groaned. A third man extended the now living torch close to the first kindling. The fire licked the air, looking for something to eat. Eleanor took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, steady. Jedediah, I'm here. I'm here, he replied without moving his lips, just with his eyes. Don't let your heart turn to stone because of me. My heart became a home when you entered it, he said. Never again, a stone. The first sparks flew and fell gently near Eleanor's skirt without reaching. The crowd leaned forward like an audience on the edge of a cliff. The torch was raised once more. The instant before the fire is a second that lasts a century. It was there, exactly there, that destiny opened a crack for what would come next. I held my breath with the whole town. The flame, biting at the kerosene, curved to touch the kindling. And what happened next? The gesture no one expected, the choice that would tear Cedar Creek in two, belongs to the next chapter. Because today, here on this day of the fire, what needed to be remembered was her dignity, his steadiness, and the face of the town looking into its own mirror. The match struck like a scream. The torch tilted, and in a single breath, the kindling answered. First a thin crackle, then the orange tongue of the fire licking the dry fibers. The smell of kerosene rose, heavy, and the square held its breath. I saw Eleanor close her eyes for a brief second, not from surrender, but to steady her soul. And when she opened them again, she looked for Jedediah's face. She found it. I'm here, he said, without moving his lips, just with his eyes. And I'm staying, she replied softly so only he could hear in the middle of the crowd. The blaze grew with the haste of revenge. The hem of Eleanor's skirt shimmered with heat. Sparks streaked the air like sad fireflies. Two deputies took a step back, because fire, once it wakes up, knows no allegiances. Silas, his chest puffed with borrowed importance, raised his voice. Now the town can sleep in peace. Peace that burns people isn't peace, Granny Hattie said, planting herself at the foot of the gallows. It's fear in a mask. It was then that Jedediah broke through the circle that held him. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't bump into anyone. He simply made himself big, like a man opening a gate for cattle to pass. His eyes were black with resolve. Sheriff Cooper tried to stop him. Don't even think about it. I'm thinking and I'm doing, Jedediah replied, already climbing the base of the woodpile. The heat bit his skin like a wild animal. His shirt opened even wider, and his chest glistened with sweat. With one hand, he shoved the pile of wood that was starting to crackle. With the other, he felt for the ropes on Eleanor's wrists. The knots were firm, the rope cutting into her skin. He pulled with all his might. The fire crackled, jealous of being challenged. No, Silas cried, his voice failing. He's saving what the town wanted to kill. He is, Granny Hattie said, her eyes wet and bright. Eleanor didn't scream. She just breathed more quickly as the flames rose behind her, licking the trunk. The heat hit her face like an opened furnace door. Jedediah made a wall with his forearm between her and the fire. His skin burned, soot painted his body gray. Look at me, he pleaded, and she obeyed. I'm not letting go. I trust you, she replied, holding his fist with her tied hands, as if she were holding her own breath. The square, which had been noisy moments before, began to fall silent. Shouts turned to whispers. Whispers turned into held breaths. A child in the back cried, his face buried in his mother's lap. Father Michael took a step forward, then another, as if the ground were apologizing with every footfall. He didn't speak. He just beat his chest and lowered his head. Jedediah found the end of the knot. He pulled it with his teeth, the taste of hemp and smoke filling his mouth. His hand was scorched. He bit into the pain, insisted. Come on, you stubborn thing. Let go, he snarled at the rope, as if speaking to a stubborn ox. The fiber gave way, then another. The offended fire burst into sparks. The flames were already eating the base in an impatient circle. Get water, someone yelled, but no one moved. Buckets, Cooper ordered, and the words sounded weak, because authority cannot command fear. Granny Hattie ripped the scarf from her head, her face uncovered like a flag, and climbed 2 steps of the gallows, ignoring her age. She stuck her pocket knife, the one she used to clean herbs, between the rope and Eleanor's wrist. Don't move, child. Breathe with me. I'm breathing, Eleanor replied, her voice a steady thread. The blade, small and stubborn, fought with the knot, a snap. Eleanor's right wrist was free, throbbing. Jedediah pulled her to him, hugging her from behind to make her his shadow. For a moment, the world narrowed. It was just the two of them and the sound of the fire eating air. Silas tried to advance, but an old man grabbed his arm unexpectedly. Enough. Leave these two alone. Let go. Silas struggled, unaccustomed to being restrained. It's a spell. A spell is your lie, the old man said, tired of himself and of everyone. Granny Hattie cut the second rope, the blade trembling in the heat. Eleanor was free, her wrists wounded like 2 red mouths. Jedediah turned her to face him, his eyes on hers, and spoke with the calm of one who accepts even the impossible. I'll get you out of here, even if it's with me beside you. If we go together, I'll go, she said without hesitation. The deputies hesitated, the fire did not. The flames scaled the side, fanned by the wind coming down from the pines. The structure groaned. Get down, Granny Hattie ordered from the side of the corral. He pulled Eleanor by the waist, protecting her with his body. They slid through a gap between the logs that he himself had opened with his shoulder. The hem of Eleanor's skirt was smoking. Jedediah slapped his hand on the fabric. The smell of burnt cloth rose, thick. From below, hands reached out. Not many, but they reached out. A woman who had once spat on the ground where Eleanor passed now stretched out her arm, her fingers trembling with regret. A boy, the same one who had thrown dirt days before, opened up space with his chest, ashamed and resolute. Over here, this way, he yelled, like someone trying to fix a roof after a storm. Jedediah jumped, his knees hitting the dirt, and made the fall a bridge for Eleanor to land safely. When they both touched the ground, a silence so great fell that even the fire seemed to hear. The square that had come to watch a spectacle was now watching something it didn't understand. 2 adults on their feet, covered in soot, their hands clasped, looking at the town, not with hatred, but with a question no one had the courage to answer. Cooper raised his stick, not knowing who to give an order to. Silas took 2 steps back, because another's courage is a mirror many cannot bear. Father Michael finally opened his mouth, but the voice wouldn't come out. It was just a my God that the breeze carried away. Let's go, Granny Hattie said with the authority of one who has led many from darkness to light. Clear a path. No one moved immediately until the old man who had held Silas took off his hat and stood to the side. Then the woman who had extended her hand. Then two more. The corridor was born, short and narrow, made of shame and admiration mixed together. Jedediah went first, pulling Eleanor with him, his body slightly ahead, like an umbrella against stones. The morning lantern, the sun, broke the mist over the pines, illuminating the specks of soot in the air, as if sad snow were falling in the heart of Virginia. At the edge of the square, Jedediah stopped, turned, and looked one last time at the burning stake, the groaning wood, and the people around it. That town that, so terrified, had almost created an irreparable tragedy. His eyes said, "I won't forget, but I don't hate." Eleanor's eyes answered, "I forgive, but I remember." And in this silent exchange, they sealed something the square would never understand. A love that burns without turning to rage. The flame remained, the rumor remained, and the story, which until then had been taken over by the noise of others, began to have a new sound. The sound of two lives that, even singed, had decided to continue. What would the town do with this? With the shame? With the guilt? With the truth that would come right after? That would be for the next chapter. But in that instant, under the sweet smell of the newly planted flower, life finally chose the right side and stayed. When the last flame finally grew tired of rising, the square was left in a silence that hurt more than the noise before. I remember the thin smoke streaking the air, as if the whole town had become a stove turned off after a meal. No one knew where to look. Some stared at the ground, others looked at the sky, hoping the bell would tell them what to do. But the bell was silent, and the silence, my friends, weighed on every roof tile. Jedediah led Eleanor down the side street slowly, his arm a steady support. Her wrists were wounded, red like the flesh of a freshly cut fruit. The hem of her skirt carried the smell of smoke, and her face held soot mixed with dignity. They didn't run. They walked like people leaving a funeral, without haste and without celebration. In the small wooden cabin, the door creaked as if it understood the gravity of what was entering. Eleanor sat on the kitchen bench. Jedediah filled the basin with warm water and brought a clean cloth. His large hands trembled a little, not from fear, but from care. "Does it sting?" he asked softly. "It's a sting I can bear," she replied firmly. "It hurt worse when I walked alone." He wet the cloth, passed it lightly over her wrists, and then blew on them like a mother treating a child's skinned knee. On the table, Granny Hattie unwrapped the herbs, took a piece of aloe vera, and cut it in half. "This will calm the skin and draw out the badness," she explained, pressing the gel on the wounds. Eleanor took a deep breath. "The pain seems to be going down slowly." "Pain goes down when it finds respect," Jedediah said, looking her in the eye. Outside, the town seemed to be waiting for orders that never came. Sheriff Cooper walked in circles, more lost than an authority without an audience. He said he would investigate the riot, but was afraid to admit his own shame. Silas hid himself in his house. His courage only existed behind a closed door. The pale priest circled the sacristy, murmuring prayers that sounded like excuses. In the late afternoon, two boys passed in front of the farm, looking from a distance. They were the same ones who had laughed at the market days earlier. The first one took off his hat in a plea for forgiveness that never quite became a word. The second quietly left a jug of water on the doorstep without knocking. Shame, too, learns to walk. Inside, the silence that lived between Eleanor and Jedediah had become a tidy home. It was no longer the silence of caution. It was the silence of people who understand each other without needing many words. He brewed a strong coffee, she lit the wood stove, and with slow hands stirred the beans in the pot. The routine there was how the two of them told the world, "We are continuing." "You saved my life," she said, breaking the pause with a serious sweetness. "We saved each other," he corrected. "If one falls, the other becomes the ground." "They'll talk more," she warned without drama. "Let them talk. A word that knows no truth gets tired. Eventually, it falls asleep." In the dark of the night, Eleanor woke up with her arm throbbing and found Jedediah sitting on the porch, the guitar resting on his knee, looking at the yard. "I can't sleep," he said without turning his head. "The body gets scared after a big scare," she replied, sitting beside him. It wasn't the fire that took my sleep, he confessed. It was thinking about what would have happened if I had arrived a minute too late. Eleanor rested her shoulder against his. We arrived at the right minute, even if we were scorched. In the morning, the midwife came back with an earthenware pot and some advice. Today you two stay put. Let the town talk with its own shame. Whoever wants to ask for forgiveness should knock on your door. Whoever wants to curse should yell at the woods. Jedediah nodded. And you, ma'am? I'm going to take care of what matters, she said, a mysterious light in her eyes. There's sick water in this town, and there's an old lie that needs some sunlight. The news of what had happened spread like the wind. First came the children from the edge of town, curious, hiding behind fences, watching Eleanor with a new respect. Then came two women who, ashamed, brought warm bread. I made it early, said the older one, not knowing where to put her hands, to thank you for what you endured. Eleanor accepted it. Thank you, and made no speech. Sometimes forgiveness fits into a single short word. In the middle of the afternoon, there was a knock on the door. It was Father Michael, his face creased with regret. I came to apologize. I lacked courage. He gave her a look that wasn't judgment. It was a mirror. Courage isn't something you beg for, Father. It's something you learn, Eleanor said. She opened this simple space. Come in, have some coffee. Maybe you'll leave here with a little of it. Meanwhile, Sheriff Cooper was signing papers that were useless, trying to give a name to his own cowardice. He thought about arresting Jedediah for disturbing the peace. He thought about it and gave up, because deep down he knew that on that day, the town had seen what was right and what was wrong, and the scales did not tip in his favor. At night, the moon washed the pines with silver, and the farm smelled of freshly washed clothes, hot soup, and skin treated with aloe vera and patience. Eleanor, sitting on the edge of the bed, ran her fingers over her wrists, now healing. Will it leave a scar? She asked. It will, Jedediah replied honestly. But a mark is also a memory of victory. She gave a faint smile. Then let it stay so I never forget that I don't walk alone anymore. And they didn't. The next day, a neighbor left a bundle of jasmine on the fence as if asking permission to learn to be a better person. A boy, the same one who had cleared the path in the square, appeared with new boards, offering to fix the part of the fence the fire had scorched. I'll help, he said, his head down, his voice scraped with remorse. Grab the hammer, Jedediah replied. Here, anyone who wants to fix something gets to fix it. The silence after the fire was filled with small steps, murmured apologies, help left without a name, and eyes that learned to look down, not out of fear, but out of respect. The town that had almost burned two innocent people began to look at itself in the mirror with less vanity. But not everything was peace. Behind curtains, poison still lingered. Silas was nursing his reasons for keeping the lie he had told alive. And Granny Hattie, with the steadiness of one who has seen much, was connecting the dots of an old truth. A truth that, when told, would not only clear Eleanor's name, but turn Cedar Creek upside down. For now, I'll leave you here on the simple porch, with the smell of coffee and jasmine, with the bandaged wrists that are learning not to hurt, because what would come the next day, the final revelation, would not erase the past, but would give it the meaning the town had refused to see. And there are secrets that only bloom after a fire. I swear I never saw the town so quiet as on the morning Granny Hattie decided to shine a light on what was hidden in the shadows. After the fire, she left early with a bucket in one hand and a worn notebook in the other. She went straight to the shallow well on the street below, the one where half the neighborhood got their water in a hurry. She knelt, filled the bucket slowly, smelled the water, tasted a drop on the tip of her tongue, and closed her eyes. It's sick, she murmured. This water will give a full-grown man a fever. She called two women, asked them to boil all their water, even for brushing their teeth. Then she shoved the notebook into her apron pocket and headed, with purpose, to the town square. I followed her because I knew. When a midwife walks like that, either a person is being born or a truth is. The square that had almost become a gallows the day before awoke to a semicircle of grim faces. Eleanor was on her feet, simple, her wrists bandaged, her hair tied back, her dignity whole. Jedediah stood beside her, solid as an old pine. Sheriff Cooper was trying to compose his authority in a wrinkled jacket, Silas, paler than usual, hid his hands in his sleeves. "Haul everyone," Granny Hattie said. "There's something that needs to be heard today." When the whole town had gathered, she climbed 2 steps onto the platform, opened the notebook, and took out a yellowed envelope with a broken seal from a long time ago. "3 years ago, I accompanied a couple to Charleston." Her voice came out clean, without a hitch. "They went to the office of a Dr. Arthur Wells, a doctor known for dealing with family matters. The husband was in a hurry to blame his wife. The doctor examined both of them. The woman was healthy. The man," she took a breath, "the man was diagnosed as unable to father a child." A murmur bit at the square. Granny Hattie held the envelope up for all to see the worn stamp. This paper was given to the husband at the time, and he showed it to no one. He hid it, and when his pride was wounded, he chose a lie to hide his own shame. Silas lunged toward the platform, his finger pointed, his voice failing. "It's a lie, a fake document. That old woman is lying." "The liar is you," Granny Hattie cut in firmly. "I was in that room. I heard the doctor. I wrote it down in my own hand, and I have more." The midwife who worked with his family in the next town over wrote me a letter confirming that the doctor repeated the examination a month later. Same result. Eleanor's eyes trembled, not with surprise, but with an old relief finally finding its way to her heart. Jedediah clenched his fists and opened them again, like a man holding back rage so it wouldn't turn into a stone. I just wanted to defend myself," Silas stammered, his feet losing their ground. "A man without an heir is a laughingstock." "So you chose to turn a woman into a fire," Jedediah said softly, his eyes cutting straight through him. "And the town helped." Silas pointed to the crowd, desperate to share the blame. An old man took off his hat. "We were wrong, but you lit the first match." Father Michael, ashamed of his own silence, stepped forward. His voice came out rough from so much inaction. I should have protected you. I knew Eleanor's character. I let fear take over. I asked forgiveness of the town and of you, my child. Forgiveness." "I give it," Eleanor replied serenely. "Forgetfulness? No. Forgetfulness only serves lies." Just then, the mother of the feverish boy ran through the street, her scarf askew, out of breath. "Granny Hattie," she cried, sobbing, "the fever went down after we boiled the water. The boy ate some bread." The square, which had been focused on the papers, learned another lesson. The sickness came from the well, not from any woman. The two truths held hands in the middle of the day, and the people, for the first time, looked at Eleanor without fear and at themselves with shame. Silas sank down on the steps, his face in his hands. He cried a wretched cry, the kind that comes too late. "I ruined her life." Eleanor took a careful step toward him and spoke without humiliating him. "You only tried to, Silas, but life found a way to take a different path." He raised his red eyes. "Punish me. Tell me what I deserve." "I'm not a judge," she said. "What I deserved was the truth, and so did the town." Granny Hattie closed the envelope, put it back in the notebook, and turned to the crowd. "If you have any honor, you will set straight what your tongues twisted. The truth isn't a stone to throw, it's a brick to rebuild with." And that's when the miracle happened. The one without a name. A woman who had once spat on the ground where Eleanor passed came forward with a cloth and began to scrub the platform, like one scrubbing guilt from her own tile floor. A boy brought new boards to fix the fence of Eleanor's cabin, the one the fire had scorched. The old man with the hat put a clay pot with a jasmine bush on the steps. "It's for her porch," his voice trembled, "to remember that flowers don't grow from a curse. They grow from care." Jedediah took the pot in his large hands, turned to Eleanor, and something broke open in his face. It wasn't a wide smile. It was the soft light of one who has found a home. "Shall we plant it?" he asked simply, like one proposing marriage. Eleanor came closer, touched the clay with her fingertips. "We'll plant it." We all walked to the gate in silence. Every step seemed to wash away a little bit of yesterday. On the edge of the porch, Jedediah dug into the earth with his hands, no shovel, as if he wanted to feel the reparation in his body. Eleanor held the jasmine bush, delicate and stubborn, and Granny Hattie settled the roots with the experience of one who has brought fragile things into the world to make them strong. "It'll bloom all year, Hattie," Jedediah said, smiling faintly. "A flower with a lasting scent," Eleanor finished, "the smell of home." When they had set the bush and covered the roots, the town, ashamed and moved, watched something be born. It wasn't just jasmine. It was the beginning of a new kind of courage, the courage not to repeat cruelty out of habit. And when Eleanor poured the first ladle of water, the same water that had almost killed her, now boiled and clean, it ran slowly through the earth and shone in the light, like a tear that turns into a sparkle. Jedediah, covered in dirt and soot, rested his forehead against hers. "I promised you a shelter," he said in a whisper. "Now the town has seen it." "I promised you I'd stay," she replied, her eyes moist. "Now the town knows that a promise, when it's real, doesn't need a witness. It just flowers." Years later, the jasmine covered the window. On the day they dedicated the fountain in the square, clean water, clean name, a little boy tried to read the plaque and got it wrong. "The Square of Eternal Love." The boy's mother laughed softly, correcting him with affection. Eleanor and Jedediah, hands clasped, watched without being seen, like people watching a miracle and choosing not to get in the way. The pain wasn't forgotten. It became a root, and a good root supports a tall tree. I'll end here with the image that holds everything that matters. Two adults, scarred but whole, walking slowly down a dirt road. Their house breathing jasmine, the town learning to be better, and the future arriving gently inside the womb of a woman they once called cursed, and who in truth was always a home. If you found yourself moved by this story of courage and redemption, make sure you subscribe to Windswept Tales. We share true stories from our past so we can learn from them and never forget.